go ahead and come on in. We'll begin our class this morning. So it sure is good to see everybody this morning. So I have a special welcome to a group back here for our sojourners that have begun to come in down at camp. Last year we worked them so hard that I see they're sitting on the back row and with an easy access. So y'all be gentle to them, be sure and greet them. There's some really nice folks from all over the country that have come in to help down there, and we really appreciate that. So as we start our class this morning, I'm a new face to you. I've not taught in quite some time, but it really is nice to be here. I've never taught in the auditorium before, so it's a matter of being acclimated and getting used to things, and I never start off fast. So I'll ramp up, and within a couple of weeks, and we'll hopefully be able to cover. We're studying the life of Christ. I have a list of different topics. When I was in the 8th grade, I had a teacher. Some of you that went to Enterprise to school may remember Miss Leondis Jones. Miss Jones was an old lady, I thought, when I had her, and it was Miss Jones. And she lived for a long, long time. We became really, after that, good friends. I learned to imitate, in some ways, the method that Miss Jones taught. She was, in my opinion, probably the most effective teacher that I had in school. She had her door open and kept one eye on the hallway and the other on the classroom, and all she did was ask questions. It took me a while to realize that she was not looking for answers per se. She was looking to develop the ability to think. And there's a distinct difference in memorizing facts and learning how to think. That aspect influenced me for a long time. Therefore, I tend to be fairly inquisitive. Some people would say rather cynical sometimes, but it has benefited me in my aspects. Therefore, I say that because as we go over things, I'm ignorant. And I really appreciate your input and your asking questions, because we tend to figure out things much more readily than we do. I hope that some of the things that we talk about will challenge you. Some of these aspects are, there's a lot about Jesus in the Bible that we really only know superficially. So we have to delve down a little bit. And that's what we want to do today, is to kind of set the stage for Jesus. And hold on just a minute. So here is our just brief study format that I hope to cover over the next few weeks. Today we're just going to do a setup, kind of a historical perspective of Palestine and Israel. And we'll look at some things. Next week, we hope to do the birth and the growth of Jesus. And then we'll proceed from there to his relationship with John the Baptist, which I think you will find, if you've never really studied that aspect, is very unique and very complex. We will look at the temptation of Jesus, his association with the apostles, the teachings of Jesus, briefly, the kingdom of heaven, his parables, his miracles. I've got a couple of parables that I've selected that I hope will challenge our thinking some. Some of them are one of them is fairly difficult, so we'll see where we go from there. The Transfiguration of Jesus, which again, sometimes we gloss over, but it has some very significance as far as his teachings and the Old Testament and how it relates to the teachings in the New Testament. Of course, his trial and crucifixion, which I would say the majority of us are fairly familiar with most of that, but we will cover that, his resurrection and his ascension. So If you have any questions about what we'll cover or suggestions, and I'm all for it. Any thoughts, questions, or whatever? Okay, well, let's get started. How many of you historians in the group? Not a single hand. I don't, Larry, I don't believe that, to be honest with you. Y'all can probably tell me a lot. I think during that coursework that I had in, I think, high school, I think I slept most of the time. So I skipped over world history, I'm afraid. But you can't begin talking about Jesus without talking about the king. And who was the king at that particular time that he grew up with? We call him what? Herod. Okay. And most of us know that the Herods were a bunch of different folks. There was his Herod that we think of. There was Herod that was during the time of Jesus. There was Herod's sons that were also called Herod. So that was kind of a term that was used fairly loosely in the Bible. So we commonly see the Roman Empire mentioned in the Bible, of course. When did the Roman Empire actually begin? You don't have to be specific, but generally speaking, when did the Roman Empire begin? Shout out.
47 BC.
47 BC is getting close. Actually, officially, about 27 or thereabouts. So a little bit newer. You remember our numbers reverse when we're talking BC and AD. Now it's called something else, I think. Not even that. But so the closer you get to zero, the more recent things are. Prior to this, prior to the Roman Empire being established, what existed in Rome? Do you remember? It was a republic, which was composed somewhat of elected officials, and they called it the Senate. Do you remember that? Do you remember, let's see who comes to mind. Of course, Julius Caesar was one of them, but he came, kind of later in the group. But he's the one that actually got really entangled over a power struggle with the Senate. And you had a lot of civil wars prior to the establishment of the Roman Empire. Okay? Do you remember Antony and Cleopatra? Those movies were made in black and white, so they were closer to that period of time in history. But those were significant players in there. They were real characters, or real people that actually influenced greatly a lot of what went on. But Julius Caesar actually adopted a son. I think it was his nephew, Octavia, and he's kind of on the fringe. You don't hear as much about him, but actually he was involved in some of those civil wars until the Roman Empire was actually firmly established on there. And back in, you read, we all are familiar with Shakespeare. A lot of what the plays that he wrote actually referred back to this part of history. Shakespeare is a lot older than we think. Do you remember when he wrote his plays? Most of it when he lived. Pardon? In the late 1500s and 16. So Shakespeare goes back a long way, but a lot of interesting history. I say that to bring us up to Herod. Herod actually was called Herod the Great. He's died in 4 BC, but he is the one in the Bible that when we read about the birth of Jesus and the worshiping of Herod, or worshiping of Jesus when he was a baby, that's the Herod, but he died. And initially in his ministry, in his reign, his kingdom, he was a pretty significant fella. The connection was his daddy. his daddy was named Antipater. He was not a Jew, but he practiced as a Jew. He converted to Judaism, but he was actually an Arab from Edom, and somehow married into the family. He goes back way back before that period of time. But his son, Herod the Great, benefited greatly from his association. So that's how the connection began with Rome and this part of the country. So he was very influential. Had a lot of. He was good friends with Mark Anthony. So he was close in close ties. Now this was his daddy, and in turn, Herod the Great also. So he was there when the Roman Empire was established. What was the importance of Palestine? And that's what they mostly called it back then. What was the importance of Palestine? Why would it have been significant to have established this relationship with Rome? Do you know? That's exactly right. The country itself was not very important, to be honest with you, but the association between Rome and Egypt was. Why was Egypt important? That's right. But when you read about in history about the Nile River, you know, we all know about the Nile and the lower Nile, which was actually toward the mouth of the Mediterranean, the upper Nile. So all of those mountains and areas that river fed into there, and as it spread out, it was a very fertile ground. It had, for the most part, had yearly flooding that took place, which renourished the soil. And, you know, biblically we read about the Jews or Israelites going down to Egypt during times of famine to try to get wheat. So they grew a lot of wheat, and they provided food and trade and goods from Africa going up into that part of the region up to Rome. So the trade route was critical, and it was critical to keep that open, and Rome wanted to make sure that nobody, for the most part, could interfere with that. So Herod the Great, the Herod that we're talking about initially, started off as a very productive king. You've seen or heard of the temple. The temple was destroyed at one time. Herod the Great rebuilt the temple. He rebuilt it basically to its probably more majestic than it was to begin with. He did a lot of aqueducts, the ability to conduct water. He had a lot of theaters that he was involved with producing and constructing. So that was a fairly good time during the history of the Jews. Most of these were public works. He hired local people to do the work. They were paid a relatively decent wage for the time. And so there was a somewhat level of prosperity during his initial reign. The problem was, and I have no idea, but they assumed that it was because of dementia or atherosclerosis or something that affected him mentally toward the end of his reign. He became much more of a despot. When we read in the New Testament about, you know, him killing the 2-year-olds, then this was apparently an aspect of that. I think Caleb, in one of his sermons several months ago, was talking about Herod the Great and the good things that he had done. But he also, toward the end of his reign, did a lot of bad things. He murdered his wife. He had several. He murdered one of his wives. He murdered one of his sons. I think he murdered his sister. The list goes on and on. So he became quite erratic in his behavior. But up until then, he was a very productive king from all indications on it. So that's one of the things in the Bible that we get an aspect. I think the Bible refers to him as a tyrant. And certainly at this particular time, he was. So any questions about we'll have a test on this right afterwards. So, and obviously I haven't gone into a lot of detail. Number one, I don't know a lot of detail. And number two, I don't want to bore you because I know we're not going to remember all of this stuff. But it does help to set the stage for the time that we find during the time of Jesus. And if we can't relate political aspects of things, then we really can't understand what went on during the time of Christ either. So, what's a puppet king? That's exactly right. So, they didn't like that term, obviously, but nobody wants to say, well, somebody else is pulling my strings on it. But that was a common term. At least that's one that we use. But all of these kings in all of these areas got their marching orders really from Rome, and Rome was interested in keeping the peace. That's what they were interested in. The more peace that they could have, the more prosperity that they could have, the more tax money that they could have coming into Rome. So, that's what it was all. That's what it was all about making sure that you had enough tax money to do the job. Let's talk about the geography of the region of Palestine. How many here? Is there anybody that here has been to the Holy Land? Got one. Well, we'll look. And what's your name? Charles. Yep. Good to see you. So we'll refer to the experts here when we do that. But again, this is important. You read so many passages in the New Testament which involve Jesus and his teachings that refer to different settings, whether it be the parables that he's taught referring to farmland or the mountainous region. So there are 5 fairly distinct areas of Palestine that go from north to south. Obviously, one of those, if I said what's to the west of Jerusalem, far west of Jerusalem, what would you name? Mediterranean Sea. It stops at the coast there. And that's a fairly narrow, I don't think it's more than, probably 5 or 6 miles, I'm guessing, of area that's fairly coastal. They call it the coastal plain. It runs almost all the way from north to south. It's real interesting to get an aspect of the size of Palestine. It's not big. Guesses are accuracy as far as size-wise. About how wide would Palestine have been? Any idea? We make it into a huge area sometimes in our minds, but it really wasn't. Somewhere around 40 miles is all wide. And it goes, some places more narrow than others. Length from top to bottom. Any idea? 120 miles, thereabouts. So not a big place. We think about, going from here to Montgomery or here to Pensacola, and it's a little over 100 miles or less than 100 miles, and certainly from here to Dothan, 30 miles. So, it was not a real big area. So these different sections of the country were not large. So going from west to east, you had a section of gently sloping hills, rolling hills. That has a name. I wrote it down. I can't pronounce it. Shafle or something similar to that is not spelled like that, but pronounced like that. So that was a fairly productive area in there of gently sloping hills. And then you reached up and got to the mountains. They call it the hill country. And it's pretty steep, it's pretty craggy, and that also goes for a section. On the other side, heading toward the east now, and Jerusalem, by the way, is in that section called the hill country or the high country. Jerusalem is in that area of Palestine too. So we've seen pictures, and we know they constantly refer to going where? To Jerusalem? Up to Jerusalem, which makes sense. You've got to go up from either side that you go to get into that hill country or hill area. So you have that area, and then immediately on the other side you had what's called the rift, R-I-F-T. The rift is basically a deep valley that was formed, and it dropped off in a series of some 3 steps from high to little to smaller, and then it drops off tremendously. What's in the middle of the rift? Do you know? It's a river, prominent river, which would be what? Shout it out. Jordan River, right. Jordan River runs from what sea? Sea of Galilee all the way down to the Dead Sea, okay? What's unique about this part of the country? If I said a rift or a valley, deep valley, what would be significant about that, or is significant about it? You remember? They were, especially up to the north. Galilee, I understand, is a fairly productive area. But there is a very deep area that goes down through there, down to the Dead Sea. A lot of people don't realize that the Dead Sea is about, I think, 1,600 or 1,700 feet below sea level. The edge of the Dead Sea is the deepest part of the earth that you can go into and stay on dry land. So when you're there, you are significantly below sea level. How about the Sea of Galilee? What's it? Above or below? Above the Dead Sea, but above or below the sea level? It's below the sea level. Even the Sea of Galilee is some 700 feet below sea level. So pretty significant area. What's in the middle of that region, of that valley or rift? A significant city. Good Samaritan said the Samaritan, or the Jew, was going from where to where? Jerusalem to Jericho, down to Jericho. And Jericho is right down in that area. So it's pretty significant. Historically, what's significant about Jericho? Old Testament. Battle of Jericho. What happened to Jericho? Walls came tumbling down. Again, we obviously are going to go by a biblical account of that, but something caused that tremendous rift when God created the world. And they still have 6 to 7 minor earthquakes in that region yearly. Billy.
Some perspective on what the sea being below sea level is. I'm sure a lot of the aviators in the congregation know that Terrace Field is about 330 feet above sea level. So you can imagine that much down, we're over 300 feet up. It makes no difference, but it's just interesting to understand what the below sea level means.
Yeah. It is, and I don't think we can understand the significance, and I'm sure if you're standing in that part of the country, maybe you don't realize how low you actually are. You've heard of Mount Sinai before, of course. What's the current name of Mount Sinai, or it's assumed to be? Mount, do you remember? Mount Hermon is his name. My Uncle Herman. I should be able to remember that. About half the year, Mount Hermon is covered with snow. It's over a mile high. It's about 7,000 feet. So, it's a significant mountain whenever you go the short distance from the Mediterranean Sea to a mountain that's about over 7,000 feet tall. So it's very significant. The Jordan River gets the majority of its water from the mountains, from the snow. We think of Israel and Palestine being significantly desert. There's a reason for that, but latitude runs east and west, right? So from a latitude standpoint, it's about the same latitude as, I understand, maybe Jacksonville, Florida, along in there, maybe a little south of there. So, pretty warm, but because of the elevation, they certainly get snow and cold weather there too but it's fairly temperate, probably not a great deal unlike our own temperature, except I don't think it gets quite as hot there as it does here. So and then we left off with the rift. So to the far east, you have another section. I don't know what they call that, but it obviously, with those mountains there, Mount Hermon, Mount Sinai is on the east side of the river. And so you get that, and beyond that is pure desert all the way to Saudi Arabia and beyond. So that area is pretty significant. So if all of that's desert, then how do they grow crops? We know they do. The New Testament tells us about that, planting crops, growing crops. So what causes the rain? Y'all are a quiet bunch today. So we're getting into physical science now, and it's no different than it is in any other place that has rain, mountains, and an arid condition. When the water comes in from the Mediterranean Sea, what happens to it? It rises, it hits the mountains, it goes up, and it rains. Okay, so there are sections of the Galilee area that does not have as big of mountains, or they're broken up. So when you get up around Galilee, the Sea of Galilee, that was a much more productive area than the south would have been. And that's why, is because the rain comes down, the shadow of the mountains on the east side have no rain, and so right along in there, all those mountains on that side are completely dry and desert-like. And the further east you go, the worse that condition gets. So the productivity and all is right in there. Some of you are familiar currently with the West Bank. We hear that a lot, all the fighting, the settlements that are going on, the disputes in the area that was won back during the 6-Day War, 7-Day War, whatever, when I was a kid. So they're still squabbling over that. But again, that's on up in north part of Palestine, or Israel, and was much anticipated land. The Golan Heights, that's another current area that you have seen, and a lot of us don't or forget that Lebanon is just over in that part of it. So once you cross the river, get up into Lebanon and Syria, all of those current places that have been around for a long, long time. It would be really interesting to go over there, because what's really neat is, the land has not changed much since the time of Abraham. So what we look at now in reality is not changed. So from a historical perspective, it's still very, very unique. Are there any questions about that? And I promise you we're through with all of that part.
Area of Death Valley, it was so hot and so Yeah, below sea level. But in that same area, you drove upward, and it got much more lush, and the temperature dropped by at least 20 degrees, because we went from 100 and something to 80 something, and just going up. So you really do see that difference.
Small mountain range. Drop to the top.
It is. Yeah, in our part of the country, we don't realize really how mountains and water can affect things. We know that we get a lot of water off of the Gulf that comes up here, and we have a lot of humidity and typically have a lot of rain. We need to pray for rain right now. We're so dry. But typically we have in the spring, a lot of rain, of course. So climate is affected tremendously by geography, and the same situation that would have found here also. Any other questions? So we want to talk in our time left about the political makeup of the people that you would have found during the time of Jesus. There were several groups, political groups, and we know those. We're very familiar with the Pharisees. That was the majority of the Jews, if they were in a group. Many people were not. Many of the common people were not. But there was Pharisees that were there. Who else? Sadducees, of course. The Essenes were probably the second most prominent group of people. This is when you do read about the Dead Sea Scrolls. These were people that lived kind of an isolated life in most cases from the rest of even the Jews on things. So you had these three major groups during the time of Jesus. I think it's interesting because typically the Orthodox Jews currently that are there now follow more of the teachings of the Pharisees as far as the law, their interpretation of the law, their adherence to the law. And so the Sadducees have not been in existence for many, many years, since basically the Jews, since probably AD 70 when the temple was destroyed and there was a great disbursement of the Jews, and the Sadducees have not been around. I don't know about the Essenes, whether they're still there or not. I thought it was really interesting, this aspect of it. This did not come from any study. This came from my association with a fellow that's a very, very sharp guy and has done a tremendous amount of traveling, including to the Holy Land. This is current situation now, about 30% of the practicing Jews in Israel today are Orthodox Jews. Basically, they're the ones that adhere to somewhat different degrees to keeping the old law, okay? I asked him, too, kind of how they functioned, and he said you're familiar with the Wailing Wall? That's really the only part of the temple that's still in existence from the old temple that was destroyed back as far as we're talking about. But these are the ones that you will see, really getting up in a fervor and dancing around. The men anyway, wear wool suits regardless of the climate, regardless of the temperature. And they will not, for the most part, associate with Gentiles per se at all, other than their willingness to sell you a trinket or something if you were to want to buy something. So, but other than that, they're very strict in their interpretation. If I give you the phrase or give you the word Shabbat, what does that mean? Because you hear that currently. That's the Sabbath, okay? The Sabbath is a reminder because, this is definitely part of the New Testament. When does the Sabbath or the Shabbat occur? Either y'all are like me, are learning a lot, or you're not willing to speak up on there. When did the Sabbath begin? 6 o'clock at night, thereabouts on Friday. Now it's more of sunset. When did it end? Same time on Saturday. So you had basically a 24-hour period. You know, that explains some of what you see in the crucifixion and the resurrection of Jesus. Why was that important? Why is that important to those practicing Jews? Because you were not supposed to do what? On the Sabbath. Work on the Sabbath. So the definition of work is one of those things the Pharisees had added to and embellished and enhanced for all of those period of years as far as the law was concerned. Now even now, it can be extreme, I think. Yes, sir, Paul.
There in the scripture, there's more than one Sabbath. The Sabbath is what we're thinking about is the Saturday, but then there's other times that they were to keep a law or whatever on a particular Sabbath.
I'm part of that. Okay. See, I'm not aware of that. So thank you for sharing that with us on it. So their interpretation of work varied, and that's one of the things that Jesus chastised the Pharisees about was, using common sense on the Sabbath. They could not typically and cannot walk more than, I think, 1,000 feet somewhere. So on the Sabbath, the Jews can go to worship service. They can go to their synagogue. They don't have a tabernacle per se to go up to. But that's one of the things that I think we've mentioned before is that's why there are so many synagogues that you find established all over the place, not only in Jerusalem and in Israel, Palestine, but also in other cities also. You have to have a group. I can't remember how many men. Manhood started at 12. They had their bar mitzvah, and generally after that they were considered to be a man, and they could form a synagogue. So you could walk to the synagogue. Those that are not Orthodox Jews are able to drive to the synagogue. But still now there's a lot of work. You can't prepare food. You can't do this, that, or the other on the Sabbath. And that's still very, very true, especially to those Orthodox Jews. I found it very interesting that high school students currently are required to have a course in, can you guess what, currently now? What is part of their study? You would not think it would be the case, but it is. New Testament. So they are required to take a course in New Testament literature or the New Testament. Why? This is it's kind of obvious and it's kind of not. What is the main industry in Israel? Tourism. So why would you want to be able to have a history of the things that are pertinent to Christians that are coming in? It's about the New Testament. We're not particularly as interested in the Old Testament. We want to see where Jesus walked, where he taught, where he was baptized, this kind of thing. So again, this is coming from this knowledgeable fellow that I've talked to. So he said, they will know more about the New Testament in many cases than what we know about as Christians, which is kind of sad. That goes back to a question that I had for him as to why the Jews did not accept the Messiah. It is really interesting. I looked up on the Israeli Department of Government or whatever they have about Judaism and Christianity and their definition of the Messiah. There's virtually no difference between their definition of the Messiah and our definition of the Messiah, except for one important aspect. Can you think of what that might be? Pardon? Well, it wasn't Jesus. It could have been. It could have been, but I can't hear, sorry. No, I don't think. No. It's very, in many ways, very simple. The fact that their Messiah, their definition of the Messiah was flesh and blood. Jesus, we know, was what? He was both, but significantly, spiritually, what was he? The Son of God. They do not accept the fact that Jesus was the Son of God. Virtually everything else, as far as the Jewish definition and outlook for the Messiah, was the same. That was, to me, was, much of an eye-opener. What does Romans, I think chapter 9, toward the end of the chapter, what does Paul tell us about the Messiah? What was the Jews' problems with it? I think it was, maybe verse 37, thereabouts. I don't remember. Billy, you looking it up? And when you get to it, while I'm doing that, because I see people coming in, I think we're ended. But that's not the only place that we find this in the Bible. It's found in Isaiah. It's found... Probably. He was born in a barn. Billy, what does it say?
The last two verses of Romans 9. Wherefore, because they sought it not by faith, but as it were by the works of the law. For they stumbled at that stumbling stone. As it is written, Behold, I lay in Zion a stumbling stone and a rock of offense, and whosoever believeth on him shall not be ashamed.
And that was their problem, is they did not believe on him, and that has established that aspect of Judaism outlook for all of these years, that they do not accept that Jesus was the Son of God. Any final questions before we close out? Well, thank you for your participation and your attention this morning.